Hi guys! In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit about the topic of corporatism. Now, I've already done a video explaining what capitalism is, and I've touched on the subject of socialism, but many times in my conversations out here in the political arena, people tend to blame capitalism for what ultimately turns out to be a corporatist problem. Now, even though in corporatist is the word corporate, it does not necessarily mean it has to do with corporations. It can relate to any special interest body, from organized labor, consumer activist groups. Corporations are included, business interests, environmental interests, anything along those lines. Any body that petitions the state for special privileges and special access to markets, sometimes even for bailouts or taxpayer money or whatever the case might be. These kind of sweetheart agreements between the state and these special interest groups is what's known as corporatism. Now, a good example of that is, many years ago, back in my home country of Trinidad and Tobago, just after the financial crisis of 2008, I was in a pretty bad way. I was involved in a real estate project that didn't go very well, didn't survive the 2008 mishap. And as a result, I decided to become a real estate agent temporarily, at least to pay my bills and to start working my way back, from the financial distress I was in. Now, back in my day, there wasn't any real entry requirement to be a real estate agent. You printed some business cards, you got listed on the most popular website for property in the country, and as long as you had access to a phone and you could put some adverts in the newspaper, nobody was any wiser. You were basically a bona fide real estate agent. Now, back in those days, there was an association of real estate agents that tried to set standards for the industry, but membership into that agency was strictly voluntary. But as time went on and more agencies started to crop up and the competition became more and more intense, that same association started to lobby the state to start to regulate the entire industry. And they wanted to impose these new requirements where, new agents had to go through almost 10,000 TT dollars worth of training. One particular company I think maybe two companies got the contract to do the training. So again, that's a sweetheart deal. People had to go from that training and they had to work for some of the bigger firms, to work their way up to become like a full broker. Anyway, and they started to introduce all of these new regulations into the industry. Now, fortunately, I got out of it before all of this craziness actually started up. But before these regulations were in place, a lot of people just on their sideline, like I knew a lot of retired persons, a couple of single moms, just a lot of, housewives that kind of did the real estate agent thing on the side just to make some extra money. But the minute these regulations came into place, all of that dried up. And the entry into the real estate market suddenly became that much more difficult, especially for young people who now had to find a pretty substantial amount of money to go through the training and do all of this other stuff. Now, of course, the companies that were big and established who were basically, lobbying for this to be done, they were not affected by this at all. They were established. They got automatic membership. They didn't have to have any of the agents go through the hoops. It strictly affected newcomers into the market. And that is exactly what I mean by a corporatist agreement between the real estate association and the state to regulate an industry. Now, I'm not saying they didn't have problems in the industry, but I mean, you'd never heard any major complaints. You never heard there was absolutely no need for this type of regulation to come sweeping through the industry, apart from to protect the established agencies from the onslaught of competition. It really gave them a monopoly hold upon the industry. Now, similarly, I mean, in the United States, organized labor, for instance, is fighting for an increase in the minimum wage. And that, again, is a form of corporatism where they're trying to impose this higher wage that definitely might benefit, people who are on that lower strata who already have a job. They might see an increase in pay, although, some of these companies might cut hours. It's not sure that it's going to benefit them. But it creates an extra hurdle for young people who are now trying to get their first job. And if the job doesn't actually, if in that job the young person cannot produce enough labor or productivity to match that wage, that person might actually not get hired at all. So again, while they're trying to push and they're using the state to increase the minimum wage for their benefit, it does not necessarily translate to the benefit of people now trying to enter the industry or enter the field, as the case might be. So corporatism and these types of regulations are generally used to try and stave off competition, limit markets, give monopolies. Bailouts are a good form of that. So after the 2008 crisis and Wall Street received massive bailouts from the federal government and other things like that, that again is a form of corporatism. So again, this is again not a form of capitalism. In capitalism, I'm not saying every company is benevolent, and I'm not saying that everybody does things right. But at least in a capitalist economy, we can vote with our dollars. If there's a company that misbehaves, we don't have to spend our money there. There's the rule of law where they can be prosecuted, fired in some cases, as the case might be. And generally, these companies can go out of business. But if there's corporatist protections for those businesses and they now get bailouts and special protections and all these other facets, it's very much harder for these. There's very little incentive for these corporations to actually act responsibly, especially when they're getting all these sweetheart deals and protections from the state. So they're more likely to take risk and do foolish things. In fact, a lot of that is what led to the 2008 financial crisis. But that's a video for another time. So with that said, again, I'm totally in favor of the free markets in capitalist societies. Very little intervention from the federal government is required. We must understand that the federal government is the biggest gun and the biggest pot of money in the marketplace. And if it is that, we're smart, we'll understand that groups are going to fight for control of that money and the ability to regulate, and they're going to try and turn it against their enemies, and it's going to be a back and forth fight. The only solution to that and the solution to corporatism is to reduce the size of the state, reduce the amount of money and the amount of power that it has to regulate and control entire markets. The smaller that power is with the state, the less likely competing groups are going to use it against each other and eventually against their, even for us, and forcing us to purchase their products or create monopolies or whatever the case might be. So again, guys, that is my video. I hope you learned something from this. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. And as always, thanks again for watching. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.